Hi everybody, thanks for joining me again as I continue to analyze William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith from an atheist perspective, one chapter at a time. In this video I'm going to cover Chapter 7, The Self-Understanding of Jesus. This is the second to last chapter. This is the second to last video in this series. Can you believe that we're almost done reading William Lane Craig's Reasonable Faith? I can't say I'm too broken up about it. I'm not going to miss this book. I'm not going to be shedding any tears bidding William Lane Craig farewell at the end of the next video. But this is the chapter devoted to the question, the burning, controversial question of who did Jesus think he was. Now this, as I mentioned in one of the previous videos in this series, this is, to me, possibly the least consequential question in all of Christianity, atheism, whatever. My atheism in no way rests on what I think Jesus thought about himself. I don't know any atheist, or indeed any non-Christian of any stripe, who has rejected Christianity because of who they think that Jesus thought himself to be. I just think it's a completely irrelevant issue. But Craig writes about it, so we're going to talk about it. And he begins with this, quote, "The Christian religion stands or falls with the person of Jesus Christ. Judaism could survive without Moses, Buddhism without Buddha, Islam without Muhammad, but Christianity could not survive without Christ. This is because, unlike most other world religions, Christianity is belief in a person, a genuine historical individual, but at the same time a special individual, whom the Church regards as not only human, but divine." How could Buddhism survive without Buddha, exactly? And the way Craig describes Christianity here as depending on belief in the divinity of a historical person who was supposedly divine, it does sound unlike many other world religions, to be fair to what he's saying. It sounds a lot more like the Unification Church, or the People's Temple, or the Branch Davidians. In other words, a cult. And by the way, which major world religion did those cults I just mentioned explicitly try to emulate? Was it Buddhism? What were the personal claims of Jesus, Craig asks. Did he claim to only be a prophet? Was he the exemplification of love and faith? Who did Jesus of Nazareth claim to be? Craig asks. Why are we being cute about this? As though the answer to this question isn't blatantly obvious. I mean, I know that it's a rhetorical device, but come on, whether you're an atheist or a Christian or whatever you are, this is a little insulting, isn't it? I mean, we know that Craig is a believer in the Bible. We know that he takes the New Testament to be historically authentic. We know who Craig thinks Jesus claimed himself to be. The Jesus we read about in the New Testament claimed to be the Son of God. Whether the actual historical Jesus ever made that claim or not, I will likely never know, nor will I ever have any reason to care. But my rejection of Christianity has nothing to do with who Jesus thought he was. It has to do with who I think Jesus was. Most of the attempts to excuse Jesus from his claims of divinity come not from outside the church, but from Christians who want to retain their faith in, or at least their reverence for, Jesus without having to deny science and history as gleefully as William Lane Craig does. The historical background. Craig goes into the three quests, as it were, for the historical Jesus. He describes the Life of Jesus movement, which in the works of Karl Barth and Carl Venturini sought to explain away Christ's divine claims by making him a member of a secret society. The Life of Jesus movement also attempted to find natural explanations for the miracles of Jesus, and D.F. Strauss came up with what is the best explanation for the miracles of Jesus, that they never actually happened. Rather, that like most of the rest of Jesus' story as told in the New Testament, they were mythical. Nevertheless, Strauss also claimed that this mythical Jesus still embodied a great divine truth about God and about humanity as a whole. And Craig mentions other attempts to reconstruct a naturalistic historical Jesus from the information we find in the Gospels, which fall short because even the earliest texts are unavoidably theological. There's just no getting around it. From very early on, people believed that Jesus had some sense of divinity. Finally, the so-called old quest for the historical Jesus ends with Albert Schweitzer, who declared that the real historical Jesus can never actually be known from the information that we have. Then there's the new quest, which followed the old quest, imagine that, which was defined by an acceptance of the theological content in the Gospels and an attempt to separate the genuine historical Jesus from that Jesus described in the theological material found in the New Testament. New questers like James Robinson drew a distinction between the Jesus who actually existed in the past and the Jesus who can be proven from the evidence that we still have available to us. The distinction between the historical Jesus and the Jesus of history, it was called. And then finally we come to the third quest, which seeks to understand Jesus within the context of Judaism. These efforts have largely focused on emphasizing the continuities between the ethical teachings of Jesus and the Jewish tradition that he came from and that surrounded him during his lifetime. The miracles of Jesus are also reinterpreted in the context of Jewish culture at the time, resulting in a Jesus who is more of a Jewish holy man than a figure of myth. On to the assessment section of the chapter, and Craig begins that section by saying, quote, "As we approach the end of the 20th century after his death, Jesus of Nazareth, now as always, continues to exert his power of fascination over the minds of men and women. From sensational films and popular level speculations to scholarly debates in academic societies, journals, and monographs, Jesus is a matter of controversy." Evangelicals just love to jack off to how controversial Jesus is, don't they? He's the central figure of the most powerful, influential, and unchallenged religion in the history of our culture. But oh, he's so controversial. He's so provocative. And believing in him, like the other 2 billion people who believe in him, is just so radical. Quote, "Who did this first century Galilean take himself to be? A political or social revolutionary? A practitioner of magical arts? A Jewish rabbi or prophet? The Messiah? The Son of God?" How does this rhetorical masturbation belong in a book that is supposedly meant to provide instruction in practical apologetics? Are there huge numbers of people who reject Christianity because they don't think Jesus actually thought of himself as the Son of God, because they think Jesus actually thought of himself as just a rabbi or a magician? I'm sure there are people who think those things, but are any of these views of Jesus at all popular? Have they ever been? What are the odds Craig's students are going to run into a proponent of the Jesus thought he was a magician hypothesis while handing out chick tracts at the student center? Denial of Christ's divine claims is the next section. Okay, so what about those who don't try to explain away Jesus' miracles or divine claims by making him a magician or a member of a secret society? What about those who say he simply never made any such claims to begin with? Craig says that most modern biblical scholars no longer think that Jesus actually claimed to be the Son of God. And he mentions the Jesus Seminar, which concluded rather famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, that over 50% of the sayings attributed to Jesus in the New Testament were inauthentic. And Craig says, quote, "In particular, these results play havoc with the popular apologetic based on the claims of Christ. According to Popular Apologetics, Jesus claimed to be God, and his claims were either true or false. If they were false, then either he was intentionally lying or else he was deluded. But neither of these alternatives is plausible. Therefore, his claims cannot be false. He must be who he claimed to be, God incarnate, and we must decide whether we should give our lives to him or not." And then Craig goes on to say that most modern scholars consider Jesus to have been neither a liar or a lunatic, but nor do they worship him as Lord. Instead, they claim that the Jesus of the New Testament, the one who made those claims to divinity and worked those miracles, is a myth. Now, before I get into Craig's defense of Jesus' divine claims, let's take a look at the logic of this popular apologetic, which Craig will also be defending. And if you remember from an earlier video in this series, this is essentially the Lewis trilemma, this popular apologetic, the Lord, liar, or lunatic false choice. And Craig, earlier in the book, sort of dismisses this as naive. And later in this chapter, in fact, he describes this as a naive, simplistic technique to use to witness to people. And yet he defends it. And his excuse is that it's perfectly fine to use the popular apologetic. You just first have to establish Jesus's cred before you do that. That's essentially what he's saying. You just have to add an extra step to it. You can't just present people with the choice of Lord, liar, or lunatic. You have to demonstrate why it's implausible for him to have been a liar or a lunatic first, and then you can force people to make that bullshit choice. So let's talk about that bullshit choice. Let's say that Jesus actually did claim he was the Son of God. We'll just give you that for the sake of argument. And let's also give Jesus the benefit of the doubt and say that he wasn't willfully lying when he made those claims. We're left then with two possibilities, according to Craig: that Jesus was sincere but mistaken in his claims to be the Son of God, or that Jesus was actually the Son of God. If we go with option 2, that Jesus was actually the Son of God, which Craig says is the only rational conclusion to come to, we not only have to accept that Jesus was the Son of God, we also have to accept every other supernatural claim underlying that claim. We have to accept that there is a God, despite the total lack of evidence for this. We have to accept that this God is the specific God of the Bible, again, despite the lack of any evidence compelling us toward that conclusion. We have to accept that Jesus was miraculously conceived through a method never described other than an angel did it, as the child of this God and a young girl. And finally, if we are to accept that this Jesus is Lord and worship him as he commands, we have to accept that he and the brutal, vindictive, incompetent God of which he is the incarnation are moral and righteous and worthy of that kind of devotion. Now, is it really more reasonable to accept all of that than to accept that Jesus was deluded when he made those claims about himself? Now, I reject this false choice. I think the Jesus we read about in the New Testament is a fictional character based on some nugget of probably undiscoverable historical truth. But even if I deny myself that option for the sake of argument, and I play Craig's game and Lewis's game here, don't assume that I've been backed into a corner by asking me liar, lunatic, or Lord, because liar and lunatic are both vastly more probable than Lord. And by the way, you can be deluded without being a lunatic. Billions of Christians demonstrate that every day. Moving on to the defense of Christ's divine claims, the Christological titles. Craig argues that the titles assigned to Jesus in the Gospels, and in the rest of the New Testament, Lord, God, Son of Man, etc., were not added to the narratives later, as some critics claim, but that they appear in the earliest Christian writings. He then moves on to implicit Christology. Although Craig acknowledges that many scholars dispute Jesus referring to himself using those Christological titles, he argues that Jesus makes other claims about himself which strongly imply the status conferred upon him through those titles. Jesus did not think of himself as an ordinary man. Rather, he thought of himself as the Son of God. He spoke and acted with divine authority. He believed himself able to perform miracles, and he claimed that what one believed about him would be the determining factor for one's ultimate fate. And Craig says, quote, "We are brought back around again to the same dilemma posed by the traditional apologetic. If Jesus was not who he claimed to be, then he was either a charlatan or a madman, neither of which is plausible. Therefore, why not accept him as the divine Son of God, just as the earliest Christians did?" Because we have 2,000 more years of science and history and philosophy separating us from the people who believed the stars were lamps hanging down from a high ceiling than the early Christians did? Because even if legend is off the table and my only remaining choices are Son of God or charlatan or madman, which they aren't even then, because again, deluded does not mean insane, charlatan and madman, no matter how implausible we take them to be, are both vastly more plausible than Son of God. Hell, make up another option. It doesn't matter how crazy. Jesus was an alien. Jesus was a member of a species of shapeshifters that live 100 miles beneath the Earth's crust. Jesus was Doug Hennig, time traveling from the 70s back to 1st century Palestine to fuck with early Christians using basic sleight of hand. It doesn't matter how crazy your alternative explanation is. It will always be more plausible than Son of God, because Son of God is one of the most outrageously implausible explanations you could ever propose. Moving on to practical application, Craig says, quote, "The refusal of radical critics to draw the obvious Christological implications of unquestionably authentic sayings of Jesus is due not to lack of historical evidence, but to their personal, anti-metaphysical, and, quite frankly, anti-Chalcedonian prejudices." Ooh, hitting below the belt there, aren't you, Bill? Can I call you Bill? Chalcedonian, by the way, means the hypostatic union, in case you don't know that. The doctrine that Jesus had two natures, a human nature and a divine nature, in a single person. It's the view of the incarnation that was agreed upon at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and which is held by most Christian churches today. I certainly can't speak for any of the radical critics Craig is referring to, whoever they may be, but I can tell you that my own rejection of Christianity has nothing to do with any anti-metaphysical or anti-Chalcedonian prejudice. First of all, who says I'm prejudiced against the metaphysical? I got nothing against John Donne, or the philosophical exploration of the fundamental nature of reality, for that matter. And I'm not prejudiced against the Chalcedonian view either. I just consider beliefs about the nature of the incarnation of Christ to have no more bearing on reality than beliefs about the length of Santa's beard. In closing, Craig advises his students to use the Jesus' self-understanding material that he's been talking about this entire chapter defensively rather than offensively. Why? Because, he says, if you open with it, obstinate non-Christians might just assert that Jesus was a man from outer space. Holy shit, do people actually say that? If so, good for them. These space Jesus believers might chalk up the resurrection to Jesus coming back to life like E.T., and I swear to God, he actually says that in this book. Confronted with such an argument, Craig advises his students to not argue with these believers in space Jesus. And Craig says, quote, "If you argue with him, this gives the impression that his view is worth refuting and therefore has some credibility, which it does not." So, the best way to deal with people who believe laughably implausible, irrational, idiotic bullshit is just to ignore them? Now he tells me. Anyway, next time we finish this fucker off. Next time I'm going to do Chapter 8 and the conclusion. Chapter 8 is subtitled The Resurrection of Jesus. The conclusion, which is very brief, is subtitled The Ultimate Apologetic. That sounds just thrilling, like a Michael Bay movie. Thank you all so much for watching this series. It's almost over now, and I think after I'm done with Reasonable Faith, I'm going to take a little break from doing this, do some other stuff with this time. But I will come back to it eventually. But doing these reviews of apologetics has been a lot of fun and of great use to me and very rewarding to me, and I think of use to a lot of you, and I really appreciate that. I really enjoy hearing from you. Please leave a comment, leave a response. If you feel so inclined. I always love to read them. Whether you're an atheist or a Christian or anything, whether you agree with me or whether you think I'm full of shit, please leave a comment or a response if you have something to say. And I will see you in the next and final video in this series for Chapter 8. Thank you for watching.